Any other questions? No? Well, I'm going to start sharing screen then, as we usually do. And we're still talking about animals, but we're starting to discuss really our last two topics. A little bit how nerve cells and the nervous system in general work. So we're going to start out looking at kind of some general aspects of nervous systems and nerve cells. And then we're going to focus on, a little more particularly on how neurons, the nerve cells, work. So when we look at a nervous system, there's a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. We have some sensory organs, obviously. Keep in mind that the 5 senses that we learned in grade school are not actually the 5 senses that biologists talk about. Biologists talk about 5 special senses. And the special senses are senses that have a complete organ dedicated to them. So you might remember back in grade school, we learned that the 5 senses were what? Taste, smell, touch, hearing, and vision. But you don't really have a dedicated organ for touch. So as a result, touch is not considered to be one of the 5 special senses. The 5th sense is actually something called equilibrium, or balance, which is located in the ear. You might have had the experience of having a bad ear infection and your balance is kind of off. You get dizzy easily. Now you do have a sense of touch. It's just that the receptors for your sense of touch are not located in specific organs. They're spread throughout your body. Now, besides the sense of touch, you have other sensory cells spread throughout your body. You have some receptors that detect hot, and some receptors that detect cold, and some receptors that instead of detecting just touch on your skin, are located a little bit deeper in the skin and actually detect pressure, someone pushing hard on your skin. You have lots of receptors, specialized cells that detect carbon dioxide, oxygen. If you really start to have low levels of oxygen in your blood, the oxygen receptors detect this and stimulate you to breathe. Under normal circumstance, you don't breathe because you need oxygen. Actually, you breathe to get rid of carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide receptors have a greater effect on your normal breathing pattern. And you have a lot of receptors called mechanoreceptors. Mechanics is a branch of physics where we look at how objects respond to movement and pressure. So actually touch receptors and pressure receptors are a type of mechanoreceptors. But you have a lot of receptors that are mechanoreceptors that are located in your joints. If you close your eyes right now and you straighten out your arm and then you bend your arm, you'll be able to tell whether your arm is straight or bent without being able to see it. And this is because of mechanoreceptors that are located in the elbow. When you were a little kid, if you ever went to the playground and played on, I don't know what you call them, we call them the monkey bars. But if you hung upside down on the monkey bars, you can tell you're upside down because of mechanoreceptors, also because of some of the receptors that detect equilibrium in your ear. And those are actually a type of mechanoreceptor. So one of the main things that nervous systems have to do is collect sensory information. And sensory cells and organs are basically specialized to detect changes in the environment. Now notice when we say environment, we tend to think of the external environment, the environment around an animal's body. But think about those mechanoreceptors I just mentioned and the carbon dioxide and oxygen receptors. Also refers to changes in the internal environment. Now also notice that sensory cells and organs detect mostly changes in the environment. So if the environment is always exactly the same, you tend to stop noticing it. Your sensory cells and organs, and then your brain, quit responding to it. You've all had the experience of walking in a room where there was a strong smell, and after a few minutes, you quit smelling it, and somebody else walks in the room and says, "Man, how can you stand it in here? It stinks." This is a process called adaptation. The same thing occurs if you're sitting in a room that's relatively dark. You may have hard time seeing it first, but after a while, your eyes adapt to being in a darker environment, as long as it's not totally dark, and your vision improves. Now, notice that these are the only type of stimulation that an animal can respond to. And when we think of the senses that people have, notice if we talk about all animals, a lot of animals are not limited to the same types of receptors that people have. A few days ago, we mentioned the duck-billed platypus, which can detect electrical currents in the water that it's swimming in. There are some animals like bees that can see ultraviolet light. There are some animals like snakes that can see infrared light. And both ultraviolet light and infrared light are beyond what people can see. We can only see something called visible light. Now, the second part of the nervous system, and what most of us think of when we think of the nervous system, the second process that occurs is integration. And this is processing and interpreting this sensory information. And this is what actually creates our perceptions. This is what creates how we view reality. This is what produces thoughts. This is what forms memories. So this is really the part of the nervous system that does the stuff that we think of as thinking. And the cells that do this are called interneurons. Inter means between, and they're between these sensory cells or organs and some other cells we'll talk about in a moment. If you would look at a person, interneurons are located in what's called the central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord. In many animals, the spinal cord is not called a spinal cord, it's called a longitudinal nerve cord, or sometimes there are two. Remember, we talked about some animals that have one on the right side, one on the left side, because most animals do show bilateral symmetry. Now, the central nervous system is what actually sees and hears and smells. Your eyes don't see, your ears don't hear. The brain interprets this information. And as a result, when we look at things like optical illusions, and this is a classic optical illusion, optical illusions don't trick your eyes, they trick your brain. So in this optical illusion, which I imagine you've seen before, if you look at this, to most people, it looks like the vertical line is longer than the horizontal line. But if you get out a ruler and you measure them, they're the same length. And in almost all optical illusions, when you have different lines or circles, they're the same size. But context can make things look different. And in this case, the big difference between these two lines, one is going left to right, one's going up and down. Well, the muscles that move your eye more quickly up and down than they do, left and right. They move, the muscles that move your eye left and right go faster than the muscles that move your eye up and down. So this is what makes the line up and down look longer. Because think about it, you've probably all been in a car at some point, especially if you're going to some place that you don't know where it is. One of the ways that we judge how far away things are is how long does it take us to get to them. If it takes you longer, it's probably farther away. But if you think about it, if you're in a city, if there's a lot of stop and go traffic, might not be that far away, traffic might just be bad. Well, here, since the muscles that move the eye left and right move it relatively slowly, it seems, I keep saying backwards. Since the muscles that move it left and right move it quickly, it seems like it's faster than this. So when we look at optical illusions, we want to keep in mind they trick the brain. A few years ago, there was a meme going around on the internet with a dress, and you were supposed to look at the dress to see what color you saw. And different people saw different colors. And there were actually big arguments online about what color the dress really was. Guess what? It wasn't really any of those colors. It was whatever that person saw, because our brains can interpret the same information differently. So it wasn't that one person was right and one person was wrong. They were all correct. So we collect sensory information, we decide what it means in our central nervous system, and then we have motor neurons. And motor neurons carry a signal to effector organs. And there are two basic types of effector organs, muscles and glands. And basically what motor neurons do is they tell the muscles to contract, because that's basically what muscles do, or they tell the glands to release a secretion. So sweat glands release sweat. Some of your endocrine glands release hormones. Digestive organs may release enzymes to help break down the food that you've eaten. So we have motor neurons, we have interneurons, we have sensory neurons. All of these neurons use electrochemical signals to communicate with each other. And with the specialized sensory cells that might be at the beginning of a chain, because some of the sensory cells actually aren't nerve cells. And they also use electrochemical signals to communicate with the effector cells. And the muscle cells and gland cells aren't nerve cells either. Now, if we look at the nervous system, there are two main types of cells. One is glial cells, which are called neuroglial cells sometimes, and neurons. So glial cells are essentially the support system for the neurons. We don't talk about them much, but if you were to look at the human brain, for instance, most of the cells are glial cells. There are glial cells that form what we call the blood-brain barrier that you might have heard of. There are glial cells that produce something called a myelin sheath that works kind of like insulation, so that the nerve signals that neurons send can travel more quickly. There are glial cells that work kind of like cells in our immune system, because most of the immune system cells can't get into the brain because of that blood-brain barrier. So glial cells really do a lot of the fundamental work of keeping neurons working. They regulate the chemical environment of the neurons. They do everything. But the neurons are what send the messages. The neurons are what communicate with the brain. The neurons analyze the information. The neurons send out a signal to the muscles telling them to move you or not, depending. So the neurons, in a sense, are what we focus on. And the neurons, get all the glory. The glial cells do all the work. So there's four basic types of neurons. One of the most common neurons is something called a multipolar neuron. Now, if we look at all these neurons, they have this big yellowish bulge. This is the cell body. And the cell body is where most of the cytoplasm and most of the organelles are located. There's a nucleus in the cell body. Now, one thing that nerve cells don't have, that most other cells in your body and other animal bodies have, is something called centrioles. And you might remember back in 105, we talked about the fact that centrioles organize the microtubules that form the spindle apparatus that divide up the chromosomes when a cell divides by mitosis. So since neurons don't have a centriole, neurons can't divide by mitosis. And this is why if you have damage that completely destroys nerve cells in your brain or your spinal cord, that damage is probably permanent, because the cells that are left can't divide by mitosis to replace those cells that were destroyed in a car accident or whatever. Now, sometimes when a person is paralyzed, it's because the neurons connecting one part of the spinal cord to another are broken. So there's no connection between the upper part of the spinal cord and the lower. But sometimes people that we think are paralyzed walk again after a few years, or sometimes after a decade or so. So you might wonder how this is possible. Well, remember what we said, that other types of cells generally can't get into the brain because of this blood-brain barrier. Since other cells can't get in, if neurons are just badly damaged, it takes a long time for these glial cells to repair them. And a long time can be years, not just a few months. So someone can be paralyzed for a few months and then at some point get movement or feeling back in that part of their body. How? Because the glial cells eventually rebuild the neurons. So besides the cell body, besides the nucleus, we have two types of structures on neurons that stick out from the cytoplasm. And one is some little structures. Notice they tend to have a lot of branches on them. There's often more than one of these, and they all come off of the cell body. These are called dendrites. Dendrology is the study of trees. So because these have so many branches, that's where they got their name, dendrites. Dendrites receive information, and they can basically receive information from two types of sources. They can receive information from another neuron. Neurons are arranged in long chains in your nervous system. But towards the very beginning of a chain, a neuron can receive information from a sensory cell. Some sensory cells are a type of cells called epithelial cells that are found on the inner and outer surface of your body. And these epithelial cells aren't nerve cells, but they can detect certain types of chemicals. So here we have some dendrites. This is called a multipolar neuron because there are a lot of dendrites. Now with neurons, there's always only one fiber that sticks out called an axon. And the axon carries nerve impulses away from the cell body. So this shows that this axon has some myelin sheath around it. And the myelin sheath is actually found by glial cells. And this is actually the insulation that allows a nerve signal to be transmitted faster. Now you might wonder why we want a nerve signal to go faster. Well, your muscles and your glands can respond faster. And when we look at the axon of some cells, if you look in people, for instance, if we look at some of the sensory neurons that are found in your foot, some of the sensory neurons in, say, your big toe, they go all the way up to the bottom of the spinal cord, which is in your gluteal region. So that one axon, keep in mind, the dendrites and cell body are pretty small, they're microscopic. That one axon is basically the length of your legs. So having a signal that travels that distance quickly is important. Now, a multipolar neuron has one axon, and notice, although I said there's one axon, the one refers to there's one axon that leaves the cell body. This axon often splits close to its edge. Now, notice where this axon terminates, it's going to meet up with either the dendrite of the next neuron in the chain, or it's going to communicate with a muscle cell or a gland cell if it's one of those motor neurons and it's at the end of that chain. Now, we also have bipolar neurons. And bipolar neurons have one main fiber that leaves the cell and forms dendrites towards its tip. And we have one axon that leaves the cell and again branches out. Notice that these types of cells don't have this myelin sheath. And this is because they're located in areas like there are some of these types of neurons in your eyes. They're located in areas where they don't really go very far. They only go a fraction of an inch. So insulating them would not really speed things up quickly. They're not long enough that the nerve signal slows down. Now let's skip over to the far right. We have unipolar neurons. And in unipolar neurons, one fiber leaves the cell body. It branches off into some dendrites. And then later, as we go further along, it branches off into the axon. It's not labeled, but this part down here below this T junction, that's the axon. And we also have some neurons that are called pseudo-unipolar. Turns out when we look at the embryology of these cells, they develop in a way that suggests they're probably bipolar neurons where the two fibers leaving the cell body fuse. So we have the dendrites in one direction, we have the axons in the other direction. Now, when we look at a nerve signal, it doesn't matter what type of structure we're looking at. A nerve signal can start on the dendrites, or it can start on the cell body. If it starts on the dendrites, notice it's going to go through the cell body here and here and here. If it starts on the dendrites here, it's not going to go through the body, the cell body. At the beginning of the axon is an area that's sometimes called the trigger point. And the trigger point basically works like a little calculator. Notice that we have a lot of dendrites out here. And each dendrite can be receiving information from an axon from a different neuron. So one neuron here might be getting input from 15 or 20 or 50 neurons simultaneously. And some of these signals are telling this neuron, send a signal to the next neuron in the chain. Send a signal. But some of the signals are telling the neuron, everything should stop here. This is no big deal. Don't send a signal any further. So at the very beginning of the area that's going to form the axon, there's a trigger point. And this trigger point, as I say, works like a little calculator. And this trigger point adds up all the signals coming in a short period of time. And keep in mind, a short period of time here is less than a second. Adds up all the signals coming in, and depending on what that number is, we're not going to look at the numerical values, but depending on what they add up to, it either sends a signal down the axon or it stops the signal right there. Nothing further happens. So this nerve impulse, or as it's traveling down the axon, it's usually called an action potential. This nerve impulse, notice these axons are always one-way streets. This nerve impulse travels down the axon down to the very tip, which you may notice looks a little bit swollen. And this tip is called the axon terminal or the axon terminal bud. It goes by a couple of different names. So let's magnify this and let's look and see what happens. So up here to the upper left, this is where our action potential, this is where our nerve impulse is coming down. This is our axon, and this is the axon terminal or the terminal bud down here, this swollen area. Notice there are some mitochondria in this area. And this is because this is going to provide the energy to push some of these synaptic vesicles towards the plasma membrane. Now remember, back in 105, we talked about vesicles coming off of the endoplasmic reticulum and moving to the Golgi apparatus, or coming off the Golgi apparatus. Remember, some of those vesicles formed lysosomes and peroxisomes. Some of those vesicles fused with the plasma membrane and released stuff to the outside of the cell. Here, the synaptic vesicle, so this is a little membrane-bound organelle, this is going to fuse with the plasma membrane, and inside this synaptic vesicle are chemicals called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters travel from the axon of the first neuron to the dendrite of the second neuron. Now the space between them, the gaps, is called a synapse, or sometimes a synaptic cleft. So notice the two cells, the two neurons, aren't touching. So as a result, when this neurotransmitter is released, it diffuses over to the plasma membrane of the dendrite. There are a lot of neurotransmitter molecules right by the axon, not as many over by the dendrite. So we know that things diffuse from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. When they get to the dendrite, they attach to a receptor. And some types of cells release more than one type of neurotransmitter. So this dendrite may have several types of receptors on it, and each receptor is specialized. So it only picks up one neurotransmitter, or at least a chemical that looks a lot like that. Now notice our flow of information in this synapse is from the upper left to the lower right. So since the flow is always in the same direction, this nerve impulse that we're talking about in this diagram starts on the upper left, moves across the synapse to the lower right. So the neuron that this axon in the upper left is part of is called the presynaptic neuron. Pre means before or in front of. The neuron down here on the lower right is the postsynaptic neuron. Post means after. So what happens when all the neurotransmitter attaches to the receptor here on the dendrite? It causes some chemical changes. And these chemical changes are transmitted. So let's go back to our neuron diagrams for a minute. So they're transmitted from wherever these dendrites are up to the beginning of the axon. And at the beginning of the axon, that's where we have that trigger point, and that's where the next neuron decides, okay, does the signal stop here or does it continue? So the fact that we got all the way down to the end of the axon on this presynaptic neuron, this means that we transmitted the nerve impulse to the next cell. Now the next cell gets to decide what to do with this. Does it continue sending a signal to the next neuron or to the muscle, whatever it attaches to, or does it stop the signal here? Now, after a short while, an enzyme comes along and the enzyme removes the neurotransmitter from the receptor. And when that happens, the signal here stops. And notice we have to remove the neurotransmitter because we can't send another signal to the dendrite of this postsynaptic neuron until we take off the old neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitters turn out to be very important chemicals. We know now that a lot of mental illness is caused by some problem with neurotransmitters. It's hard for me to be more specific. We'll look at a couple of examples, but could be too much, could be not enough. So let's think about some of these neurotransmitters. So the one that's been most studied is a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Notice the INE ending, and remember that when we see that INE ending on chemicals, it generally means that they have that amine or amino functional group, that NH2 group, or sometimes NH. Acetylcholine is found at what are called neuromuscular junctions, where the nervous system connects with muscles. And it's the main nervous neurotransmitter in what we call the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. We'll see that abbreviation again in a moment. Now, peripheral means outside. So the peripheral nervous system is outside the central nervous system. So acetylcholine has been studied more than any of the other neurotransmitters for one simple reason. You can collect acetylcholine where a nerve cell communicates with a muscle cell, say in the biceps of your arm, or in the hamstrings or the quads in your legs. Most of the other neurotransmitters are only found in the brain, so it's a lot harder to collect them. We can also do some pretty simple experiments on muscles using neurotransmitters. You know, we really can't do experiments on people's brains. That can foul things up long term. So if we look at acetylcholine, it's a good example of the fact that what can attach to those receptors? Anything that has the same shape. So there's a chemical called mustard gas, which is one of the main types of nerve gas that's used. And mustard gas actually blocks acetylcholinesterase. And acetylcholinesterase is the enzyme that takes acetylcholine off, that takes the acetylcholine off the receptor. So if acetylcholinesterase can't do its job, what happens? That means acetylcholine just sits there on the receptor. So the muscle keeps contracting and keeps contracting and keeps contracting. So what happens when you get hit with nerve gas? You go into convulsions. Your muscles contract uncontrollably. And in fact, since one of the muscles that contracts uncontrollably is your diaphragm, the muscle that does most of the work when you breathe, a lot of people who get hit with mustard gas suffocate. On the other hand, there's another type of chemical called curare. And curare is a mixture actually of a bunch of chemicals. It's used by natives in South America. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's what the natives are shooting at him through their little blowguns, or that's what they have tipped on their arrows or their spears. And curare is a chemical that paralyzes you. And curare, like I say, it's a combination of several chemicals, but again, it actually attaches to the receptor for acetylcholine. Now, how does it paralyze you? Well, acetylcholine is supposed to attach here, and when it attaches, it causes your muscles to contract. If curare attaches here, it blocks acetylcholine, so acetylcholine can't attach, but it doesn't stimulate your muscles to contract, so you're paralyzed. So when we look at this, what we see is anything that has a similar shape could potentially attach to that same receptor. Most neurotransmitters are made from amino acids, but some of the particularly small ones are called biogenic amines. And there's two main groups of the biogenic amines. One is a group called the catecholamines, which have some names you might be familiar with. You might have heard of dopamine or norepinephrine, but you've almost certainly heard of epinephrine. You probably know somebody who has to carry an EpiPen. What you may not know, what's the other name for epinephrine that probably is a little more common, that more people have heard of even than epinephrine? Does anyone know?
Is it
Adrenaline?
EpiPen?
Yep, this is adrenaline. So really, when you're having maybe an allergic reaction or something else, epinephrine increases your heart rate. It increases your breathing rate. It's a stimulant. So that's the idea behind using this when you're having trouble breathing, for instance. The other main category of these biogenic amines is a group called the indolamines. They have something called an indole group. And a good example of this is a chemical called serotonin. So let's look at what a couple of these do. Dopamine is released by neurons in some of the pathways that coordinate your muscle movement. So you've probably heard of a disease called Parkinson's disease. Michael J. Fox has it, Muhammad Ali. And if you've ever seen people with this disease, people who have Parkinson's disease, often their hands shake. They seem like they're not stable. Well, keep in mind, this is for a very simple reason. If you look at the muscles in your body, well, we can talk about the bones for a second first. You've got a little bit over 200 bones, but you have more than 600 muscles. And this is because a lot of your muscles work in groups. If you look at your upper arm, for instance, there's a muscle that many people have heard of called the biceps brachii. This is what you see when Popeye makes his muscle. This is that muscle that bulges out. The biceps brachii is what flexes your arm. The biceps brachii bends your arm at the elbow. Now on the underside of your arm, there's a muscle called the triceps brachii. And the triceps brachii straightens your arm out. So when I say that dopamine coordinates muscular activity, when your biceps is contracting, when you're flexing your arm, your triceps is supposed to relax and let your biceps do its work. But in people with Parkinson's disease, the biceps and the triceps are both trying to contract at the same time. And so this is why you see that kind of shaking movement, is because the muscle that moves the arm one way is kind of being opposed by the muscle that would move it the opposite way. Now, if we look at norepinephrine, and notice this is just a slight chemical variation on epinephrine. So it's also called noradrenaline. This is associated with attention and arousal. We're not talking about sexual arousal here. We're talking about arousal as in staying alert and awake. A lot of antidepressants increase the amount of noradrenaline that's released. Drugs called amphetamines do the same thing. That's why they're uppers. Serotonin is also associated with attention and arousal. If you have abnormally high levels, it makes you sleepy. If you have abnormally low levels, they're associated with clinical depression that's very severe. So one of the most famous drugs in recent years, a drug called Prozac, prevents the enzyme that removes serotonin from the receptor from removing it. Because a lot of people who are depressed because they make unusually small amounts of serotonin. So Prozac doesn't help them make more, but it does help them keep the serotonin that they do make for a longer period of time. And then finally, we have a drug called LSD, and LSD randomly combines at receptor sites for serotonin in the brain. So this is why LSD leads to hallucinations. Since it randomly combines, your brain doesn't know quite what to think, because in your brain, normally neuron A communicates with neuron B, and that communicates with neuron C. And neuron 1 communicates with neuron 2, and that communicates with neuron 3, and that communicates with neuron 4. So neuron 4 shouldn't respond unless it gets a signal from neuron 3. But if neuron 4 just starts responding and it hasn't gotten a signal from neuron 3, your brain doesn't really know what to do, how to interpret that. So you hallucinate. LSD is a good example of what happens. Scientists often experiment on themselves. The first scientist who discovered LSD ingested a small amount of LSD to see what effect it would cause. He ingested a tiny amount. Unfortunately, what he didn't realize at the time is neurotransmitters are incredibly powerful. You don't need very much. So even though he ingested a fraction of a gram, he actually took enough LSD that something the size of an elephant would go on an LSD trip. Miraculously, he didn't seem to have suffered any long-lasting damage from this. Now, another type of neurotransmitter that's also made from amino acids is called a peptide. And peptides are relatively long chains. And there's a whole group of peptides called endorphins. And endorphins are opiates. So they have they belong to the same chemical family as opium, morphine, heroin, things like that. And these are produced during stressful situations in your body. They help you avoid the stress because they calm you down. If you've ever trained for a marathon, when you run long distances, marathon runners sometimes experience something called runner's high. When you first start running for 15 or 20 minutes, you're kind of out of breath, your sides hurt a little bit, it doesn't feel great. And after a while, when you've been running, it starts to feel very peaceful, and long distance running is sometimes compared to a form of meditation. Why? Because after 15 or 20 minutes or 25 minutes, it depends, varying on the person, but your body starts producing these endorphins in the brain, and the brains make running feel like a pleasant experience. Well, why should your body have evolved so that running's a pleasant experience? Well, because if you go back a few thousand years ago, our ancestors didn't do all that much jogging so that they could win a marathon. When they were running away from a predator. So you can't afford to stop just because you're a little bit out of breath or your sides hurt. You need to keep running. Endorphins are also produced during childbirth, although not quickly enough, according to my wife. So that childbirth is, maybe I wouldn't say pleasant, but less painful than it could be. But they're produced during not just bigger events like running or childbirth. They're produced if you're trying to park and somebody else squeezes into that last parking spot. Or you're going to have a Pop-Tart right before you leave to go to school and the toaster doesn't work. So minor stressful situations. So since these endorphins are opiates, that means they fit into the same receptors. So here's a chemical diagram of, this is kind of the basic skeleton framework for endorphins. There are several different types of endorphins. And this is the chemical framework for morphine. Well, notice if you look in the area covered by the little boxes, these portions of the molecules are very similar. There's an oxygen atom here in morphine that we don't have in natural endorphins, but other than that, the structure is very similar. And this means that when we look at one of the neurons in the brain, the morphine can fit into the same receptor that the endorphin that the brain produces fits into. So for people who take heroin or morphine or codeine or opium, in many cases, the body stops making its own endorphins. Why? Well, think about what I just said with our discoverer of LSD. If you take a small amount of heroin or morphine or codeine or cocaine, that's a lot more than the amount of endorphins that your body comes to make. So if you take these types of drugs more than a few times, they're strongly addictive. Why? Well, because if you're using cocaine, your body quits making its own endorphins. So now it's very difficult for you to quit taking cocaine because guess what? Any type of stressful situation means you have nothing to cope with because it's going to take a while for your bodies to start producing its own endorphins again. So if you're not taking cocaine, all of a sudden you have no source of endorphins to help you get through the everyday stresses that you're going to face. So that's the main reason why these types of drugs are addictive. As soon as you take them more than once or twice, your body shuts down producing its own endorphins because you're kind of flooding the brain with way more than it can produce. So what's the point? Now, when we look at the nervous system overall, you can break the nervous system down into several branches. So we have the central nervous system, and the central nervous system has two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. That's two parts if we're looking at vertebrates. So mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, fish. Remember what we said earlier, there are some animals that have two longitudinal nerve cords. So they have the equivalent of two spinal cords. Now, this part of the nervous system is where we process that sensory information and where we decide what it means and then tell the muscles and glands what to do. So the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the central nervous system. It's the things in our body that we call nerves. Some people think of the nerves as being the same thing as the brain or the spinal cord, but actually the nerves are outside the brain and the spinal cord. The nerves are what allow the brain and spinal cord to communicate with other parts of your body and also allow the other parts of your body to communicate with the brain and the spinal cord. So if we come over here to the purple region, this is the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. It's sometimes also called the sensory division. And they divide this up into two categories, sensory stimuli and visceral stimuli. Sensory stimuli are coming from external sources, visceral from your internal organs. A lot of people don't divide the sensory division or the afferent division up into these two branches. Now notice afferent means towards, and this is because all the neurons in this branch of the peripheral nervous system, they all conduct nerve impulses towards the central nervous system. In most cases, there's just one neuron, either from your skin or from an internal organ or from a muscle. In most cases, there's just one neuron that carries the signal from wherever it's located to the brain or spinal cord. That's why earlier I said you have neurons that run all the way from your toe all the way up to the bottom of the spinal cord in the gluteal region. Now, the other branch of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, has many more divisions. Notice that the pink arrow is going out. So this is telling us that in this case, this is how the nervous system communicates with these other parts of the body. And this is the efferent division, or it's sometimes called the motor division. Efferent means away. Now, the efferent division has two main divisions. One is the somatic nervous system, one is the autonomic nervous system. So let's look at the somatic first. Somatic means body. So remember when we talked about chromosomes back in 105, we talked about somatic cells versus gametes. So the somatic nervous system has motor neurons that travel to your skeletal muscles. Now, your skeletal muscles, as the name suggests, are muscles that are attached to the bones of your skeleton, or they're attached to other skeletal muscles in some cases. Notice that these muscles are mostly under your voluntary control. You know, if you're in a classroom instead of a virtual class like we are now, your arm doesn't raise itself to ask a question unless you tell it to raise yourself. Now, a lot of times we aren't aware of telling our arm to raise itself to ask a question because we're so used to it, we don't have to think about what to do. But if you've ever seen a little baby when they first start to walk, sometimes they lift one leg up in the air, and then they kind of pause for a few seconds because if you're not used to walking yet, keep in mind there are about 60 muscles that are involved in walking. If you're not used to walking, if you've just started, you kind of have to think about what to do next. Now, for us, we've been walking long enough. Hopefully you don't have to lift your leg up in the air and pause for a few seconds to figure out what to do. Now, besides the somatic nervous system, we have the autonomic nervous system. And I'm not sure why, but they don't show motor neurons over here. And the autonomic nervous system does use motor neurons also. When you see autonomic, think automatic, because the autonomic nervous system is mostly involuntary. The autonomic nervous system sends signals out to smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is the muscle that's in your blood vessels that maintains your blood pressure. It's the muscle that's in your digestive system that keeps the food that you've eaten moving through the digestive system. It's the muscle that's in some organs called your ureters that push the urine from the kidney down to the urinary bladder. And the autonomic nervous system also sends signals to the exocrine glands. The exocrine glands, exo means out, these are the glands that secrete materials onto the surface of your skin. Things like sweat glands, which obviously secrete sweat. Things like sebaceous glands that secrete oil onto the surface of the skin. And some of the endocrine glands are also controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. For instance, there's a little endocrine gland under the brain called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland releases a hormone called oxytocin when it's stimulated to by the brain. And oxytocin is one of the things that helps you retain water. Now, you need to retain water because one of the main things that your kidneys do is they filter waste out of your blood. In fact, they filter about 40 gallons of waste out of your blood every day. However, you don't urinate 40 gallons of waste every day. A typical person only urinates about 1.5 quarts of urine a day. So 40 gallons of potential urine is produced, only 1.5 quarts is eliminated. Why? Because antidiuretic hormone produced by the pituitary gland helps you reabsorb 39 gallons and 2.5 quarts or so. So this is caused by two competing systems, and not just this, but everything that the autonomic nervous system does. There's one system called the parasympathetic system. And the parasympathetic system is involved in something we talked about way back in chapter 1 and 105. This is involved in maintaining homeostasis for you. So this is involved in regulating your body temperature. So remember when we talked about, you know, ectotherms and endotherms and heterotherms and homeotherms. It's involved in doing the housework for you to digest your food. And then for you to eliminate your feces after digestion. It's involved in doing the housework for you to form urine and then eliminate your urine. So the parasympathetic system is involved with homeostasis. The sympathetic system is sometimes called the fight or flight system. This is the system that's involved when you have to do things involving a very quick response. You're walking out to your car at the mall and it's kind of dark and somebody kind of pops out from a car next to yours. Well, maybe they were bending down tying their shoes, or maybe they're going to try to mug you, and your heart starts beating faster very quickly. You don't have to think about this. So the fight or flight branch of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic branch, gets you ready for emergencies. So it starts sending signals to your muscles because you might have to run away or you might have to punch them out. It starts sending more blood to your lungs because if you're going to be in a fight or you're going to be running, you need to deliver more oxygen to your muscles. So when we look at these branches of the nervous system, notice that in other animals besides vertebrates, we don't necessarily see all these branches. We do see an afferent division and an efferent division, but we don't necessarily see all these different divisions within the efferent division or motor division of the nervous system. So keep in mind, some animals, really most of what we've been talking about doesn't apply today. Remember, sponges have no nervous system at all, period. And if we look at cnidarians, things like jellyfish, they do have something called a nerve net. They have kind of a grid work of nerve cells that run through their body, but jellyfish have no brain. They have no central nervous system. So unlike all the neurons in a person that are basically one-way roads, the neurons in a jellyfish are two ways. They can send signals to the right or to the left. Doesn't really matter because there's no brain that's going to do the processing. The nerve cells in jellyfish help them respond. So jellyfish don't like metal. So if you have something called a blunt probe in medicine, you can poke a jellyfish and it will kind of flinch and pull away a little. But it does that because it knows where the stimulation is coming from. It doesn't have a brain telling it to pull away. Are there any questions about neurons and nervous systems from what we've discussed today? Okay, if not, then I will let you go. And what we'll talk about Wednesday, I almost said tomorrow, what we'll talk about Wednesday is some of the consequences of this. So we'll look at what happens, how these impact animal behavior, and look at the different types of behavior that animals exhibit. And keep in mind, probably on Thursday, you'll want to make sure that you have a calculator app handy on your phone or your computer or your tablet, whatever you're using, because we will be working some problems with math again. I know we haven't used one since back when we looked at natural selection and things, but we will be doing that again on Thursday. So enjoy the rest of the day. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them before we leave.
Have a good day.
You too.
Take care.
Bye-bye. See you Wednesday.
Have a good evening.
You too. But it's not evening yet.